İyi akşamlar. Ben bu konuşmanın organizatörlerine Engin Akyürek ve GABAM'ın diğer meslektaşlarına ve Koç Üniversitesi'ni hepsini ayrı ayrı teşekkür etmek istiyorum. And as my Turkish stop here, I will continue in English. So I would like to thank the organizers of this lecture, Engin Akyürek and all the other colleagues and staff of GABAM. First of all, for having included me in the advisory board of GABAM, and secondly, for giving me the opportunity to meet you tonight and to present you the Greek archaeological landscape of the last 2 decades, and also the faith of the Byzantine monuments from the 19th century onwards. Today I will talk to you about archaeological discoveries, about towns, houses, and everyday life in the early Byzantine period. But before, I will introduce you to the archaeological landscape in Greece from the 19th century onwards, and to the faith of later Roman and early Byzantine monuments until recently. And of course, someone like me who is working on that period since the early 90s could not avoid to speak about the loneliness, for not saying the marginalization of the researchers focusing on early Byzantine field archaeology in Greece. And this is something I experienced many times, as well as many Greek or non-Greek colleagues working on the period between the 4th and the 7th century AD. So please allow me to start with an autobiographical reference, a short story from my long Delphic experience. So in the early 90s, I was a young scholar working at Delphi, and I was sitting late in the afternoon at the front door of the storeroom of the French School of Archaeology. And I was, of course, surrounded by thousands of shirts in an effort to find some matches. And at that moment, the late director of the French school, Pierre Amandry, maybe some of you have known him, he approached me holding his precious Lubitel 166 camera. He nodded and said, "Vous savez, jeune homme, il y a quelque chose de très monacal dans votre boulot. You know, young man, there is something really lonely in your work." And I still wonder, 23 years later, if by the term monacal he meant lonely, or literally monastic. And what Amandry told me about the loneliness of the pottery expert I was trying to do at that time corresponds well, in my opinion, to the loneliness experienced by many of my colleagues working on early Byzantine period for many generations. Because, as you know, most specialists of the ancient world call the period being on the verge between the ancient times and the medieval times late antiquity, and they rarely consider it as something worth studying. For their part, most medievalists do not consider it as actually belonging to the medieval era. So you can imagine the identity crisis a young scholar could have at that moment. The fact is also that the monuments of this era, although discovered in considerable numbers since the 19th century, only occasionally attracted the interest of specialists before the 1970s. But to be honest, this was the fate not only of late antique or early Byzantine monuments, but mostly all medieval antiquities of Greece for more than 100 years. During the first attempts to establish urban planning in the small Greek cities of the first independent state, the scholars were not very interested in Byzantine remains, and that was not motivated by political or religious reasons. I remind you that Greece at that time was governed by Bavarians. but simply because medieval antiquities at the early 19th century were out of fashion, and mainly because a direct connection to the golden age of ancient Greece was considered essential in order to establish a new national identity. The triumph of neoclassicism in the private, but especially in the public buildings, overshadowed any architectural form reminiscent of Rome or Byzantium. And there is only one exception to that rule. The eye hospital of Thalmiatrio in the center of Athens, where architectural elements inspired from Rome and mainly Byzantium were used to create a very strong antithesis, a very strong contrast with the neighboring academy, university, and the library buildings, what we call the neoclassic trilogy, and also with the also neoclassical church of St. Denis, the Catholic Church of Athens. So although a partial care for antiquities was established by the first law for the protection of antiquities back in 1834, it took decades before archaeologists and architects of that time stopped neglecting the Byzantine monuments. The excavations carried out in the 19th century in most of the very well-known archaeological sites in Greece, Olympia, Delphi, are characterized by a sort of contradiction. They uncovered thousands of square meters dating to the late Roman and early Byzantine period, but they lacked serious scientific treatment. In some cases, like what we call the lower baths in Delphi, were discovered by the Grand Fouille at the end of the 19th century, but they have been destroyed to allow research into lower layers or to facilitate the admission of tourists. But meanwhile, inspired by political or, I must say, patriotic or theological motives, some scholars turned their attention to the medieval period at the beginning of the 20th century. And it is on their initiative that societies for the promotion of medieval studies were created. A few years earlier, a forerunner, Georgios Lambakis, founded the first society of that kind in 1884, the Christianiki Archeologiki Ekteria, the Christian Archaeological Society. And the name he chooses for his society shows that he was motivated by his deep Christian faith and the necessity of preserving the remains of the first centuries of Christianity. He started the publication of the most important Greek review, the Deltion της Χριστιανικής Αρχαιολογικής Εταιρείας, still in press in Greece, and among other books that he wrote. And at the same time, he took many photographs. He was a very good photographer during his journeys, and he collected thousands of items dating mainly to the early Byzantine period. And these items come to be the main core of the collections kept in the Byzantine and Christian Museum in Athens. The first centuries of the first decades, of the 20th century were also marked by a couple of field archaeologists, Georgios and Maria Sotiriou. They traveled through the newly extended country, digging up monuments mainly of the early Byzantine period, as in Nicopolis, in Epirus, or Nea Kielos, the Phthiottian Thebes, in Thessaly, or restoring them, as was the case of the church of the Basilica of St. Demetrius at Thessaloniki, partly destroyed by the fire of 1917. And you can see how the monument was after the fire. Sotiriou was the main person who did the restoration, responsible for the restoration of St. Demetrius. However, Despite the excavations that uncovered remains of the period under discussion, one may wonder whether the late Roman or early Byzantine archaeology of Greece did really exist during most of the 20th century. Early Byzantine remains were under the responsibility of either of classical archaeologists or historians of Christian art. And in the meantime, the exhaustive and almost exclusive study of icons and frescoes and of religious architectures by many generations of Greek art historians and archaeologists left no place for the study of secular monuments and objects of everyday life. And of course, all these were very often interpreted through the scope of religion. I give you just an example, the very well-known sigma-shaped tables that they were considered to be always offertory tables, and the buildings in which they have been found, they were classified as churches only because they had an apse. So let's go a bit forward to the decisive turn to the history, to the study of material culture that was manifested in the 1960s and 1970s. The archaeologists of that generation, the nouvelle vague of the archaeology at that time, there was not only the nouvelle vague in the cinema or in music, but also in archaeology. Archaeologists like Jean-Pierre Sodini and Michel Spizer were the first to undertake in Greece general studies of topography and pottery, or to detect social phenomena in the changes observed through archaeological remains. Some years later, the study of technical procedures in the manufacture of the early Byzantine objects has been introduced. And also considering the dating, stylistic criteria gave place to more concrete criteria. The early Byzantine period offered a large spectrum of study possibilities, as in many, many places in Greece and almost everywhere, the architectural remains were well preserved, but few were still the archaeologists working on that period, especially on its secular monuments and everyday life humble objects. A new reality in the Greek archaeological landscape regarding the treatment of this period of early Byzantine period arose in the 1990s. Systematic excavations and extensive or intensive surveys were then undertaken, conducted by foreign or Greek institutions. These efforts resulted in a number of publications, unfortunately not as many as one would wish, but at least a considerable number of articles on various early Byzantine sites or regions of Greece, and the most important on inter-regional studies. Some older fields of work, such as topography and especially pottery, came to be in fashion in the last 15 years, reflecting the determination to study aspects of everyday life and the transformations of urban and rural landscape. Monographs on pottery published after the year 2000 concerned the sites of Eleftheria, Halasarna, Argos, Athens, Delphi, and other monographs on architecture and topography of that period concerned Thessaloniki and Argos. Collective studies are very helpful for anyone working on this period. And of course, one should not omit historical monographs like the book of the late Anna Avramea on the Peloponnesus, or the more recent book by Helen Saradi, an interdisciplinary approach to the study of early Byzantine cities. At the same time, the contribution of what we call the hard sciences opened new fields, specialists of early Byzantine Greece becoming, after the prehistorians, among the first to seek answers in the methods of these sciences. Pottery analysis, petrographic and chemical, were carried out at many sites in order to determine, for instance, the origin of pottery groups, like in the case of Central Greek painted ware. Maybe you cannot see it very well because the video projects us, but I will try to explain you that there was a theory that this kind of pottery that you can see a thin section at left, that John Hayes called Central Greek painted ware was coming from Delphi. And we compared sherds from late Central Greek painted ware with the local pottery from Delphi, and of course you can see there is a big difference, and also a big difference in the thin section, but also a big difference in the percentage of all these things, thank you, in the chemical analysis of all these oxides of metals. So if we move now from systematic research to rescue excavations, we should first of all take into consideration the urban expansion of the Greek towns, which went through a period of prosperity during all the 1990s and a part of 2000s, of course, before the crisis. This prosperity was expressed through the erection of new private houses and public buildings, and, which is very important, the renewal of civil infrastructure. I mean, roads, subways, drainage systems, etc. These works necessitated hundreds of rescue excavations conducted by the Greek Archaeological Service all over Greece, which brought to light new evidence from the early Byzantine period, because remains of that time are very often visible near the surface, mainly in the case of sites abandoned after the 7th century, when there was not a modern, there is not a modern city on them. Some of these rescue excavations lasted for years and are comparable to systematic ones in terms of the amount of money spent and the number of professionals involved. And this is the case, for instance, for the excavations of the Athenian underground, to which I will return later. Regarding the archaeological service, it was enriched with new blood through competition. Nikos Kondogiannis was one of them. In 1993, 1994, and 2004, and also in 2006 and 2007 through other procedures. So this fact that there was a lot of new blood coming in the Greek Archaeological Service, in combination with, I quote, the unprecedented challenge of the resources made available to the service for the first time thanks to the funds of the Third Community Support Framework, European money, led to an outbreak of projects involving digging, conservation, restoration, reconstruction, and enhancement. I should say that the Ministry of Culture absorbed almost 90% of the European funding budgets, and this is a quota never surpassed by other parts of the civil service, by any other ministry. And of course, I will refer only to some of those works. For instance, the highways all around Greece, the two main highways, the one going from Patras to Evzoni via Athens and Thessalonica, the other one which is called Via Egnatia, also going from Igoumenitsa to Alexandroupoli. We had also the modernization of the railroad from Athens to Thessaloniki, work not yet finished. The new water pipeline for the city of Thessaloniki, the metro of that same city, and of course the Athenian underground, the unification of archaeological sites in Athens, the new Acropolis Museum excavation, and the new international airport in Athens. So you see a lot of civil infrastructure, which was very good also for us, the archaeologists. So due to time limits, I will not refer to any surveys, although their contribution to the recognition of the urban and mainly the rural landscape could be very helpful. I will not refer also to systematic excavations in prestigious sites well known for their early Byzantine period, like Corinth or Philippi. I will only focus on sites not clearly related in the collective subconscious to the period under question. And our first key study is Athens. Athens is one of the sites, of those sites, and I will start with it because, of course, everybody knows where Athens is. Right? maybe not, you don't know all the other cities. So I will start with it because the case of the Greek capital is representative. More than any other modern Greek town, it reflects the two phases of the urban expansion. On the one hand, a great number of rescue excavations providing new evidence for many periods, and on the other hand, only a few cases of preserved secular ruins and a very fragmentary image of the ancient town. Athens is very famous for its antiquities, of course, but certainly not those dating from the early Byzantine period. At the same time, most of the funds spent on the amelioration of Greek infrastructures have been invested in Attica. Among others, two great projects are closely related to the early Byzantine period: the construction of the Athenian Underground and the new Acropolis Museum. Earlier rescue excavations in plots all around the modern city center, as well as the systematic excavation of the American School of Classical Studies in the Agora and on the Areopagus, and those of the German Archaeological Institute on Keramikos, offered a fragmentary idea of the early Byzantine town. We know that there were urban villas, of course not all of them to be considered as philosophical schools, a few public buildings in the new center east of the classical Agora, around the Roman Agora and the Library of Hadrian, workshops, installations of various types, and a fortification protecting only a small part of the town called Late Roman Wall. I show you a general map of the of Attica with one of the biggest infrastructure works, the what we call the Attikiodos, a very big highway, the airport, the Athens airport, and of course the Athenian Underground. The excavations for the metro started in 1992 and ended in 1997. And they were the opportunity to gain some more parts in the jigsaw of early Byzantine Athens. The new excavations revealed two kinds of urban contexts: the industrial areas, such as the workshop at Agios Somatis Square near Keramikos, and another pottery workshop at Evangelismos Station, and residential areas and baths, mainly from Syntagma Square Station and the nearby National Garden. The one on the left is from the excavation of an early Byzantine villa in the National Garden, and this is on display near Zapion. This is a late Roman bath. The excavation at Agios Somatis Square with the lamp industry workshop, they revealed a kiln, additional structures, molds, kiln supports, and a considerable number of wasters, as you can see. Those are lamp wasters. Giving an almost complete idea of how a workshop of that time must have looked like. The excavations at Syntagma and Acropolis stations, the latter communicating with the new Acropolis Museum, were also of great importance, and it seems that in late Roman times and early Byzantine times, the area of the new Acropolis Museum was occupied by luxurious villas whose life apparently continued well into the 7th century. You see these villas complexes here, and some of the findings from a well, one of the many wells found at that place. Please keep this in mind, because in the next slides you will see how the excavation, this is this circular room, this is how the excavation looked when it finished, and this is how it is now with the new Acropolis Museum constructed over the ruins. There is a place here, so maybe you can. conservation, restoration, and enhancement of ancient ruins, we must refer to an almost original experiment, the transport and exhibition in the open-air section of the Museum of Archaeology and the History of Art of the University of Athens of some architectural remains discovered at Syntagma Station, and among them a thermal complex of the 3rd century, rebuilt in the 5th century, and some of the findings of the metro excavations are also exhibited inside the metro station halls, creating, let's say, a cultural environment in rather impersonal spaces. Those are from Evangelismos and the other from Syntagma Station. Let's move now to the north. To Thessaloniki. In Thessaloniki, already during the application of the second European Community Support Framework, many archaeological sites were restored. One of them was the so-called Palace of Galerius, and its final restoration and landscaping presentation took place in 2002 after a thorough investigation which began in the early 1950s and continued until 1971. And of course, they brought to light a restricted area of the complex because the modern city of Thessaloniki is constructed over it. In 2000, the restoration of 2 buildings covering a total area of 4,000 square meters was completed. And in 2002 followed the conservation of the ancient floors, the restoration of the baths and the octagon that you can see there, and the landscaping of the entrance of the archaeological site. The new water pipe line crosses the city from the west to the east, from the west where the Aliakmon River's barrage is situated. And archaeological speaking, it starts from the western necropolis here, goes through the ancient and medieval town inside the city walls and ends at the eastern necropolis. And among the most interesting discoveries, there are a lot of discoveries there. There are parts of the city walls of the early Byzantine period, streets, decumani and cardines, an inn for worshippers, near the Basilica of St. Demetrius, workshops and houses, tomb, and a cruciform building, partially discovered, most probably a church of the 6th century. Some of the discoveries of the underground of Thessaloniki, of the metro of Thessaloniki, like the monumental crossroad of the Roman and early Byzantine city center, discovered during the works for the construction of a metro station, provoked a vivid discussion about the conservation or not of the findings in situ, and an unprecedented participation of the local population at the conflict between the metro construction company and the archaeologists. And it seems that the local population and archaeologists won this battle for the moment. So those findings will not be removed from their original place. During the last 15 years, the Greek Ministry of Culture also organized interesting exhibitions both in Athens and Thessaloniki, including early Byzantine artifacts. And one must also stress the fact that the 2 main Byzantine museums of the country, the Byzantine and Christian Museum of Athens and the Museum of Byzantine Civilization of Thessaloniki, happily completed their new permanent exhibition areas and during this period, during the last 15 years. And the early Byzantine period has its own part in the museological concept, not only and of course the religious things from items from basilicas and churches, but also coming from houses and villas. We will now move to another part of continental Greece, Delphi. It is well known for most of the important established archaeological sites. More or less concrete images have been formed in the collective memory. These notions include an approximate idea of the period of flourishing and also the moment of decline. The archaeological site of Delphi, that you might have visited already, one of the first excavated in Greece. The excavation started in 1892 and ended in 1903. Delphi is not an exception to the rule. Until the beginning of the systematic excavation of the early Byzantine remains in 1990 from the French School of Archaeology at Athens, although buildings of that period were standing at a height of several meters, no one talked to the visitors about this period. It was considered to be more appropriate that a place so deeply influenced from the ancient Greek spirit in its every expression, religious, athletic, even political, would have died together with it. What modern research, however, has been able to show is that Delphi not only survived the transition from the old religion to the new, from paganism to Christianity, but even was a flourishing city that had no need to envy other provincial towns of southern Greece. And this new approach actually extends Delphi's occupation period for 2.5 centuries, dating the end of the continuous period during which it was inhabited to circa 620. From 1990 to 1997, as I said, a team of the Greek Archaeological School excavated the so-called Roman Agora, certainly the forum of the town, as well as a huge habitation complex called Villa Sud-Est, Southeastern Villa, or House C. This villa, just outside the ancient sacred wall, which you can see here, constitutes a typical example of a private building with reception rooms, storage rooms, accommodation rooms, and a small but very elegant private bath. The picture is enriched with other small or bigger private villas of the early Christian period. The most important elements of information on the history of Delphi in the early Byzantine period, and especially of the last period of the city, have been indeed provided by the excavation of this southeastern villa. Constantly increasing prosperity has been attested from the 5th century onwards through the 6th century. And this is indicated by the transformations of the house plan and the addition of other triclinia. We call triclinium the reception room. A first abandonment at around 580 comes to interrupt all these elaborations. A few years later, the rooms have been transformed into workshops, and we have pottery workshops. You can see the kilns there, 3 kilns here and here. And we have also a tannery or dye workshop. A final abandonment of the place, which corresponds with the end of the city of Delphi, is observed at around 620. The years between 580 and 620 bring an evident reduction of the urban fabric. However, the last quarter of the 6th century ceases to be the benchmark for the total abandonment of Delphi, as had been previously supported. On the contrary, the existence of workshops producing pottery exactly the same as before 580, the import of ceramics that continue, albeit reduced, and the coins prove that life in Delphi survived until the first quarter of the 7th century. The combined evidence offered by modern research, which has been presented in very brief, converges at a point which leads to a picture of welfare and comfort in this small medium time in the period from the 4th to the 7th centuries. This new picture is very remote, of course, from the impression established in people's minds of a ruined, deserted, and forgotten place after the decline of the ancient religion. Although not in the mainland, the case of Thasos is worth examining as almost the same image that Delphi arises from another excavation there. And of course, it's so close to the coast. The more recent excavation at this place started in 2004 at the capital of Thassos, Limenas. The city is well known for the Greco-Roman phases, since its foundation as a colony from people coming from the island of Paros. It's also very known for its sanctuaries and houses, very thoroughly investigated. And I'm talking about ruins of archaic, classical, and Hellenistic period. Recent research expands on earlier studies in order to establish a map of the early Byzantine city of Thassos. And I'm glad to show you one of the latest studies published just last week from the French School of Archaeology at Athens. It is a work of my professor and maître de pensée Jean-Pierre Sodini and Manuela Antoni Coselli, and it concerns an infeum of a luxury villa in the city of Limenas. The French School of Archaeology of Athens, the University of Lille, the National Kapodistrian University of Athens, the French CNRS, and the Greek F8 of Kavala joined their forces in a multidisciplinary project called Domus 5, an enormous villa erected at the end of the 4th century AD, covering more than 1,000 square meters in surface, just in one level. Its construction incorporated an ancient, probably a public building here in its northern aisle, and it blocked, of course, the passage going to the Acropolis and to the theater, but this was something attested very often at that period. I mean, houses blocking passages and roads and streets. The eastern aisle of the house contained a very big triclinium, an apsidal triclinium, framed by rectangular rooms. And of course, we have, as everywhere in luxury villas, a number of rooms with for different purposes. Exactly, and of course, we have in Thassos some interesting internal decoration. We have frescoes and, of course, mosaics. Exactly as in the case of southeastern villa of Delphi, a radical change is attested to the house at around 570, 580. Of course, it continues to be inhabited until 620, but some of the rooms have been condemned, and the diet of the population was based on hunting and shell fishing. We have found thousands, tens of thousands of shells like that from the last period of the house. The excavation of Domus 5, still in progress, is providing us with new data, which will probably help us understand better the local end of the early Byzantine period on the coastal sides of the island. Still in the area of Macedonia, this time in its central park in Pieria, the site of Luludies was excavated by the local Byzantine F8 from 1993 to 1997 during works from the new railway between Katerini and Thessaloniki. This site was probably the Roman Mancio or Mutatio Anamon and became under the Tetrarchs a local administrative and taxation center. The Bishop of Pydna was transferred there after the Goths were allowed to settle in Pydna in order to stop the siege of Thessaloniki in 479. The new site, it's a very small one, 80 by 90 meters, was fortified with towers, as you can see. In the era of Justinian, the bishop's complex lost its fortified character and expanded with the addition of a kind of industrial zone. We have a lot of wine presses, olive presses, storerooms, and shops in the place of the bishopric palace. In the middle of the 6th century, the bishop's complex was destroyed. Everything was destroyed, and only a part of the basilica was reused, a phenomenon attested also in other places in mainland Greece and otherwhere. The settlement continued, however, and intensified its economic activities with the addition of new storerooms. At the end of the 6th, beginning of the 7th century, probably after an earthquake, the bishop's complex was abandoned and dilapidated, but metal, glass, and brick manufacturers were then established, probably for covering the needs of the inhabitants of the surrounding rural settlements. The place was definitely abandoned for unknown reasons in the second half of the 7th century. Luludies is a particularly interesting site not only for its complete investigation, but also for its continual transformation. And it can be used as a model of a very small town, helping us greatly in our understanding of local economies. Another key study is Edessa, always from the region of northern Greece, so rich in excavations, restoration, and presentation. Systematic excavation carried out for long periods by the local F48 in a rural suburb have revealed a street with porticos, shops and workshops, storerooms, unidentified public buildings, all protected by a defensive wall. Alternating piers and columns support the arcades of the main street. Those porticos are large, 5 meters 20, and they served shops and workshops. The finds are very interesting, among them a seal with the menorah and the inscription Theodoro, a gift from God, and a small column also decorated with menorah prove the existence of a Jewish community in the town. But also a Christian basilica was excavated, a very beautiful one, and part of the necropolis revealing the reuse of Hellenistic tombs. From the end of the 6th century, a progressive shrinkage of the urban fabric is attested. People seem to move towards a fortified upper part of the town, which will evolve in the next few centuries to what we call in the text the god-protected castle of Vodena. The restored and presented area of the lower part of the town around the porticos constitutes a restricted but well-documented commercial part of a medium-sized town of the early Byzantine period. And our last key study is Masini, because I had to put something from the south also. The provincial town of Masini in the Peloponnese is well known for its classical and Hellenistic phase. And it is a good example of a radical change in the mentality of our colleagues, classical archaeologists. Since 1986, when systematic excavation started again, almost all the ancient Greek and Roman buildings have been excavated, restored, and enhanced in an exemplary archaeological park. The early Byzantine monuments have also attracted the interest of the scholar. This is why I talked about the changing in the mentality of classical archaeologists about the importance of phases after antiquity. So a lot of early Byzantine monuments attracted the interest of the scholars, and questions about the common characteristic between Masini and other cities of the area, or the presence of Slavs, for instance, have been examined quite early in the case of Masini. Urban villas and smaller houses, churches, among them a basilica in the place of the amphitheater, a Christian basilica. Original sculpture and sporadic Christian tombs create an impressive complex of an early Byzantine town, where from the 5th century onwards, professional activities occupy progressively more or less central spots of the town and former exclusively domestic areas. Putting together all these dispersed pieces of information I tried to describe above could lead us to some general conclusions about the fate of Greek cities during the early Byzantine period. In order to summarize the knowledge deriving from archaeological fieldwork, the conclusions of various researchers, and the publication of the last 15 or 20 years, I will summarize something like that. We have certainly changed our perspective of the period between the 4th and the 6th century, which is henceforth considered as a period of continuous changes in the physiognomy of the cities and the countryside, but also as a period of welfare. These changes led to a development of some new urban or rural landscapes. It is obvious that a long and slow process took place, mainly in continental Greece. I will avoid the general used shorthand term from polis to castron, preferring to refer to a new model of city, the early medieval or Christian city. Where we observe in this kind of city, we observe the abandonment and dismantlement of the ruined ancient public buildings, the installation of professionals, houses and tombs inside these public spaces, the transferring of the civic center to new unused spot of the towns, the abandonment of the temples of the ancient religions, the appearance of the Christian buildings replacing ancient sanctuaries or other private or public buildings, the dramatic changes on the street layout, and finally, the collecting of ruins and the erections of new buildings. That was the case of the Greek cities from the 4th to the 6th century, let's say from the mid to the middle of the 6th century. From the second half of the 6th century, we observe the abandonment of the luxurious villas constructed before, or their division into smaller spaces, or their reuse for professional purposes. The shrinkage of basilica surfaces and the construction of smaller cult spaces, the installation of necropolis within the cities, the systematic recycling of building materials and shrinkage of the urban fabric, the multiplication of smaller settlements, all this resulted finally to a new lifestyle and eventually to a new period. The myth of the abandoned cities of Greek mainland at about 580 after the first attacks of Slavs can no longer be sustained, as can now be shown by the excavations all around Greece. Although we are dealing with a kind of decline, if we consider it through the scope of late antique urbanism, the end of the 6th century and the first decades of the 7th century should not be seen anymore as the end of an era, but the beginning of a new period lasting until the 9th century. The vitality of small peripheral towns, the interactions between them, and the continuous activity of the great Mediterranean production centers stand as further proofs of the above observations. We can therefore consider the early Byzantine period as a gateway, an introduction to a new, different era. An era where changes would be long and sometimes silent in terms of archaeological or textual remains, but they will lead quite normally to what we call main medieval period without any external intervention as happened in the West. İngilizce için çok teşekkür ederim. Are there any questions? Yes. Or remarks? Yes.
As you can expect, I will go to the houses. So I have a question about the changing the houses from the mid-6th, late 6th century onwards, because that's a phenomenon that we also have very clearly here in Asia Minor. In particular, you said in the case of Ulusal that it is the bishop's palace that goes through this kind of changes. What do you think that happened?
The bishops moved for a long. I'm sorry.
No, just do you have an idea? Was the
yes, the bishop was moving from Pydna to Luludies and then back to Pydna when the Goths left. So we know from historical sources that that happened in 479. The bishop was obliged to leave Pydna and move probably to Luludies, and then the excavators say that the place was abandoned, and it was workshops and other manufacturers that took the place of those buildings. But a small basilica, a small church was still in use, probably for people still living there. But Luludies had no more its importance as a place of, as a bishopric place, seat.
So you're very privileged to have the literary sources.
Sources in the case of Pydna and Luludies, yes. This is Efterpi Marquis who made the excavation, a very exemplary excavation. But what we have in all the other places that we very very usually people cannot afford, I think they cannot afford to live in those big, huge mansions. Look what is happening in places where an economic crisis are hidden by an economic crisis. People cannot afford to live in very expensive houses, and they move to smaller ones. And we know that in some cases, big houses, big rooms were divided in smaller ones. So maybe there were people, I don't know, refugees coming and taking their place.
Thank you for having resuscitated late antiquity in Greece. I think for all of us archaeologists, your lecture, Platon, makes us think about how we excavate and what we excavate. And I wonder whether there's anybody now digging in the archives and storage rooms of excavations that may have not considered the late antique period, trying to find something. And my other question is a follow-up about what you just said, and it's what we define as the so-called age of crisis, which in reality oftentimes may come with a much higher level of creativity. And I wonder, as archaeologists of the late antique period, what may we do in order to look for signs of creativity and community action, beyond the abandonment of a triclinium or something like that?
I will start from the second question. If we study small secular objects that nobody was studying before, and this is happening only if you do a research in the storerooms of the museums, of the archaeological museums. And yes, this kind of research there are a lot of young scholars doing this kind of research, although it's quite difficult because people who excavate that have always the rights to publish them, and not officially, of course, but unofficially until their death. But yes, there are a lot of young scholars digging in the museum storerooms and trying to reborn this very, how would I qualify it? This period which is on verge between antiquity and medieval times. And I think what we have to do is to still work on these kind of things. 20 years ago, that was unconceivable. A Byzantine archaeologist not working on icons or frescoes or, I don't know, religious architecture. But there is a part of a reality there, and we have to look at it. And speaking about creativity, yes, if you see how the small producers of pottery in medium or small towns all over the Greek mainland interfered, how they copied one another, how the molds circulated and the fashions circulated, that means that there was a dynamism. Even at the end of the 6th century and the beginning of the 7th century, there was a dynamism everywhere in mainland Greece, although it was the beginning, the prelude of the so-called Dark Ages and so on. But people were still working, living, worshipping, producing. So what happened after 620, 630, 650? We don't really know yet. A lot of the ancient towns were abandoned. This is a fact. And we know, for instance, that maybe they didn't have any, they didn't use any coins. Okay, there was an exchange. They were living maybe in exchanging communities, but maybe they were living in huts that left no traces, but they needed to use pottery, and we don't have, in all those towns, we don't have pottery after the 7th century. And this is a kind of question we have to look at it for the future. Why those cities were abandoned, and why not all the cities were abandoned. So I hope I asked your question by another speech. I'm sorry. Yes, Anesti.
If I can ask you to go a little further into this direction, if one compares the sites that you have presented, which reflect an urban lifestyle, even the villas, with more humble rural installations, I don't know if we have such examples excavated. Do we come into a clear distinction between two different lifestyles, modes of life, and is this movement of populations, the Slavic installations, reflected in
the ruralization of towns? It's in fashion. Yes, I know. A lot of people think that towns were transformed to villages, and I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure. If we see it from the scope of the late antique urbanism or Roman urbanism, of course, this is a decline. But life is still there, and they are still producing the same things. They are still using the same materials. Of course, if we consider the diet of the population living in Domus 5 in Thassos, they, at the last decades of the life of the villa, they live by hunting and shell fishing only, because we analyzed all the bones and everything. So that means that they are poorer. You know, when we are dealing with hunting and shells and everything, we are maybe thinking about Roman dinners and something prestigious, but this is not the case. They are living by hunting and shell fishing or fishing, because they don't have goats, they don't have sheep, they don't have animals like that. So they are poor. They are poor, and their niveau de vie is lower, but they are still there. This is what I find important. If there's no other question, I can sit. Thank you. How was it? You want the students here, so I think it's